Welcome to Two Bees in a Pod. I am Bilola.
And I am B. Leonga, and this is a podcast about immigrant experiences in the U.S., sharing our perspectives on various topics,
including straddling cultures, fitting in, staying connected, learning and unlearning the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Today, we're going to be talking all about food. We have Ozoz Sokoh, and we will be introducing her and her work in a little bit. But Ozoz, we always start with an icebreaker. So our question today is rank your top 3 travel destinations for food.
Top 3 travel destinations that I've been to or that I'd like to go to.
I was thinking that you'd been to, but maybe if you've eaten something from somewhere and you're like, this is the best thing I ever had and I need to go to this place. Yeah.
Okay, so, and Nigeria doesn't count, right?
No, you can't use your home country.
Definitely Zanzibar. Amazing food in Zanzibar. Zanzibar, 1. I would like to go to India and experience the different regional cuisines. And I think Ivory Coast, Abidjan. I had some great food in Abidjan.
Nice. Good choices. What about you, Bilila?
Okay, so I'm going to have both places I've been to and those I haven't been to. 3, I would say Spain. It was most unexpected. Like, I expected good food in Portugal, which I didn't get, and then that was my fault. But walked, randomly found a market somewhere in Madrid and had, really, really good food. And then I imagine that I will have the time of my life in Thailand, just eating everything. I am convinced they would need a flatbed to wheel me out of Jamaica.
Those are pretty amazing destinations, actually. All 3 of them.
Yes. So for me, I mean, this is not, I can't rank them, but in the top 3, Morocco, I went to Casablanca and I went by myself. So it's like, I would order all of this stuff and just sit there. I'm sure the waiters would look at me like, bro, what's wrong with this woman? I eat and eat. It was so good. I loved the food there. You're right about Thailand. And one thing about Thailand, so maybe I was coming from America and being naive, because here when you go to a restaurant and you say you want something spicy, they'll bring it and you're like, this thing's not even hot. I went to Thailand. I was like, yes, spicy. Listen, Thai people, they're all spicy. It's not like they don't play. I was literally choking. When Thai people talk about spicy, they mean it. So, yeah. Bilala, whenever you're going, you need to probably ask for medium. Nope. Yeah, but Thailand. Nope. And then also, as I'm with you, India is definitely on my list of places that I want to go. And I love Indian food, right? But obviously it's different when you're eating it not in the country. And like you said, I don't know anything about the different regional cuisine. So that would be really interesting to explore. So yeah. Good choices. I'm curious, in Zanzibar, was it seafood that you were eating mostly?
It was everything. So Zanzibar there's some Indian influence, lots of spices. So whether that was the tea, the flatbreads, the grills, the fresh fruit, and fruit juices and drinks, the vegetables, everything was fresh, tasty. It's just amazing.
Nice.
Actually, I think not just even Zanzibar, but many parts of Tanzania, because I've been to Dar es Salaam and Arusha, and the grills, the flatbreads, the street food, all of it was delicious.
Now I'm curious. I want to go to Tanzania because I went to Kenya last year, and I just want to say something also. So as Cameroonians, I tell everybody that I'm a little too proud when it comes to food. And Kenya was such a letdown. Now, I slander everybody's cuisine as rule of thumb, but Kenya, I didn't really have anything. And so in my Cameroonian way, I wrote off all of East Africa. So I think that
that's interesting.
I don't endorse that message. Just for anybody listening.
I went to Kenya. I went to Nairobi. And again, I fell in love with the food. It was very similar. So fresh grills, Lots of great juices, delicious fruit. Like I had a pretty good time. So much so that for many years, I wanted to move to Nairobi. I haven't even Nairobi is still top of the places that I want to live in across the world. I'm not just saying on the continent.
I can see that. Like, I completely enjoyed Nairobi. It was the first African country that I'd gone to outside of Cameroon.
Okay.
And just it was so organized. That was the most mind-blowing thing coming from Cameroon to that was just how organized everything was. But I would say that at the time I told myself, even if I came back here, I would bring my own food with me.
Wait, so do you research what to eat before you go to a place? Like, do you kind of like create, like familiarize yourself with what's available and like...
So my brother was getting married to a Kenyan.
Okay.
And so I didn't do much research because it was like I would have that direct connection and I could always ask, like, what do you recommend? And we were in Nairobi for a bit and we went to Mombasa. And in Mombasa, I kept asking, like, so what is the local cuisine? What can I try? But I didn't get anything, honestly. So I'm not sure. But in other places, I would research, try to like go online, look for what people recommend and their experiences. But yeah, that didn't happen there.
Interesting. Well, we are speaking to Ozoz Sokoh, aka the Kitchen Butterfly, and she is a culinary anthropologist, a food historian, and researcher. And she shares her love and passion for food through her blog, kitchenbutterfly.com, where she shares recipes, essays. She also has a free digital library, Feast Afrique, where she has curated digital resources on the culinary heritage of West Africa and the diaspora. Apart from that, Ozoz's body of work includes other projects like documentaries, exhibitions, and mentorship. Ozoz, before you came on the air, I was just telling Bilola that I was watching your documentary on agege bread, and I found it really interesting because in Cameroon, we have a bread called Kumba bread. Kumba is a city, a town in Cameroon, and Kumba bread looks very much like agege bread, just a different size. So watching that now has made me curious. I'm going to go back and see if I can find anything on the history of Kumba bread, because in that documentary, and the listeners can find this, I found it through your link trades on YouTube, but they talk about, the history, why it's called agege bread. And I found it really fascinating. So yeah, now I'm curious, where if Kumba bread has a similar history, because I've never had agege bread, but just appearance wise, they look identical apart from the size.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of Kumba bread, so I just made a note.
Yep. So thanks again for joining us. Can you share a little bit about your background, your upbringing in Nigeria, and your education?
Okay, so I grew up on the southern coast of Nigeria in a city called Warri, and grew up in a family with many siblings. And my dad was a marine engineer, and my mom was a teacher. And both my parents were really... my dad's passed now, but both my parents were really, really into food. And when I say into food, I mean not just eating, but like crafting. My dad was like a real utensil geek. So, he had like convection ovens before they were a thing. Like he had all of the gadgets, popcorn maker, this griller. He was just very interested in the craft of food. My mom, one of my aunts is a chef, and she was a chef at one of the Hilton hotels in Nigeria. And so she'd always bring us like all sorts of fancy pastries, and she would like introduce my mom to new recipes. So my mom too was also a huge experimenter. Like my mom would make Nigerian fried rice, which has roots in Indian cuisine, but also Chinese cuisine. She'd make different versions. She'd hear of a technique, she would implement it. She was always testing things out. So I grew up around food, even though I wasn't a big eater till I was about 9. But it was just this sense of the importance of food. We sat together as a family to eat. dinner most nights. So there's just something. Food was an important part of. And so I went to university as well for a brief period. I studied town and country planning, or urban and regional planning. And then I quit and I went abroad. I went to the UK. I studied geology. And I think that's when my understanding of the different dimensions of food really took root. So I was homesick when I was in the UK, and I started looking for Nigerian food or food from my childhood as a way to, kind of soothe that homesickness, as a way to comfort myself. So, yeah.
So yes. Now you gave a TED talk in 2014 where you talked about the early years of your life and like actually not liking food at all. And you went on this trip, your dad took you, I think it was to Edinburgh, and you had some fast food and then this amazing experience where that was kind of a turning point. Can you talk a little bit about that and what was it about that particular meal that changed things?
I think that I was never really allowed to be hungry when I was growing up. There's a way you're hungry that they'll present food before you and you'll eat. I don't think I ever got a chance to be hungry from like 0 to 9, because my parents were always, someone or the other was always trying to feed me, from what I heard. My dad took my older sister and I think for the first time, like we were out all day. We had done like proper touristy stuff because it was in the summer. We went for a particular festival. It was the Edinburgh Military Tattoo Festival. And I think I was hungry. I think I was exhausted. I was hungry. I'd worked up an appetite. So when the food came, there was no question. I wolfed it down to the extent that I asked for a second meal. And look, after eating the second one, I cried because like I was so full. It was the first time I was that full. And years later, I asked my mom, like, why did she think? So even before I thought, I think it took me a while to think about the fact that perhaps I was really hungry. But my mom also thought, when I asked her why she thought that I kind of went for this, why I ate the meal and, asked for seconds. And she was like, she felt like it was something different, right? Like the food was different from kind of what we had at home, which partly was true, but I grew up eating burgers, but I don't know if it was before or after this particular incident. But my mom just thought it was something about being in a different place, being in a different time period and all of that. So, that bit of travel and exploration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you went to school, to study things that were totally unrelated, right, to food and what you're doing now. So how did you get started on your journey and the Kitchen Butterfly blog? Like, when did that take off?
So my mom was an English teacher, which meant that I wrote a lot as a child. Like, I tell my children now that I've written essays about pets I did not have. Like, there's no composition. Like, I grew up very familiar with the written word, with paper, with reading. And so writing was always a natural extension of my hobbies or my living. Like, it was part of my daily life. I started writing poetry at maybe like 12, 13. And when I went to Liverpool, in my first year, I told my friends that I wanted to be a singer. And they were like, look, the only thing you can sing is rap. Okay, whatever. So I was like, okay, you people will be here. Anyways, I wrote a poem about living abroad and being away from home, but exploring it through the lens of seasons. I won first prize. I got to meet the Lord Mayor of Liverpool. I got to receive my prize in the town hall and all of that. And my friends were like, okay, well, so maybe just stick to poetry instead of, this mythical music career you want to embark on. And so and then when I was in Liverpool, again, homesickness, I started cooking to kind of reclaim power and strength and, and to find home in the cold and all of that. But I remember one day I went to visit a very good friend of mine in Manchester. I went to university in Liverpool and Manchester, close by. And we bought this jar of Doritos salsa, and it was really good. And we were students, right? So we're always managing our money. And then I looked at the jar and I was like, this jar is $2.99. I could pretty much buy all the ingredients and make this salsa. And like, it would give us probably like 10 times the quantity of this $2.99 jar. So I read of the ingredients. It was like 75% tomatoes. Anyway, read of the ingredients, crafted my recipe. That was 1999. I still make the recipe today. My children make that tomato salsa recipe today. It was so much better than the jarred one. And I think that was a bridge for me because I studied geology, so very scientific, experimentation, observation. As I was able to bring all these skills into the kitchen, into recreating and recrafting this salsa. And I don't think I've ever really looked back since then.
It's funny that you talk about like science and like being accurate and measurements. And okay, I'll be honest, like I'm not the best cook. And my struggle, particularly with Cameroonian food, is that when you ask somebody how to make something, they will never tell you the measurements. Listen, I can make something 10 times. I need to know how many cups, how many teaspoons.
I think it's important to understand how recipes have evolved, but also the fact that some recipes can be made with like general proportions, and others require a certain amount of specificity for them to be successful. It's the same with Nigerian cuisine. Just add small. In fact, it's the same with most cuisines, right? The Indians, I think it's in Urdu, they have a word for it that basically, I think it's andaza, that basically translates to loose estimation. In Chinese, there's a word, and I'm not sure if it's Mandarin or Cantonese, but it's like a ling, and it means like the appropriate amount, right? Like just put the appropriate amount. And the appropriate amount comes from, there's observation, right? There's understanding texture. I think there's a whole sensory approach that sometimes we don't think about, but there's what do you see? What do you smell? How does it sound when it's cooking? Right? What does it feel like? What are the textures? What does it smell like? Because if you're making soups, for instance, like there's like jute soup, like ewedu in Nigeria, like this viscous green soup. There's a smell when you first cook the leaves and when it's ready. It goes from kind of like a vegetal, kind of like a bright, really green smell to something else that's, slightly more rounded. So I feel like I appreciate loose estimation. I appreciate the conceptual, here's a pot of stew, these are the signs we're looking for. And I also appreciate situations like moi moi or akara, where there are particular ratios that must be followed for success.
Yeah. I mean, I understand what you're saying, right? About like looking at the color, the texture. You gotta have a little bit of skill, or I guess it's, and you talked about this, I think, was it on your TED Talk, like trial and error, right? You have to, I guess at some point of making something so many, many times, if you don't give up like me, you'll eventually get to that point, right? Where you're like, okay, this is the color that's supposed to be, the oil should have separated like this and all of that. So yeah, but I found that to be, like a struggle for me, making something that I've never made before. It's like, I just put, this is very loose.
Don't you also think about it in a sense that I use the example that in boarding school, for instance, my friends will all bring chin chin, but we knew everybody's mother's chin chin, where I always say we went to school in September. So the rich chin chin was like the September chin chin because we had choices, right? At that time, everybody had chin chin. So you're targeting the person with like the the really good one. And then my friend's mother said, this is school chin chin. She didn't even put milk. We called it fingers because she just cut it anyhow. It was for sustenance, not flavor. That was October, November chin chin because at that point you're hungry. You take whatever they give you. So it was like in September, it's like, save that for later. So I think about food like, it's like we know the general flavor profile you're looking for, but you might have somebody who likes a little bit more pepper than the other person. For instance, cooking eru. Ozoz eru, I don't know if you're familiar with eru. Eru is
Okazi. It's okazi leaves.
Yeah, so it's afang. It's afang because it's ukazi leaves and water leaf. And so my mom is very particular about like her eru has to be bright green, like you just took it out of the garden. Where sometimes like if you go buy eru like at a restaurant, it's usually really black and she does not, like her eru has to be really fresh green. So I think that's some of the nuances that come with cooking. But I hear you on, you want to know like how much Maggi should I put or how much crayfish.
Like, listen, I'll measure everything just right. And I do appreciate like there are some Cameroonian bloggers who they have recipes on there, and listen, like they measure everything, whether it's in grams or cups, and I really appreciate them because they'll do it even for things that normally people wouldn't, right? Like soups and stuff. So yeah, shout out to the Cameroonian food bloggers. They've saved me. Okay, so you do a lot of work. You write about West African cuisine, right? And it's so diverse. Even when I think of Cameroonian cuisine, like when I meet people, they try to ask, can you describe what Cameroonian food is like? And it's difficult, right? Because it's so diverse. But how would you describe, are there key characteristics of West African cuisine that kind of make it, unique, where somebody could say, okay, I recognize this is West African cuisine because of this flavor profile or ingredients?
Can I ask you a question first?
Yes.
Which cuisine do you find easy to describe? Is there a cuisine?
That's a really good question.
I want to say like overall French cuisine. I wouldn't say, because I was going to say French, but then like there's probably regional cuisine.
Yeah.
But when I think of French food, I think creams, butters,
butter,
dairy, cheese of sorts.
Okay, that's because I don't West African cuisine. I think that West African cuisine, if I was to describe it to someone, I would say starches, soups, stews, sauces. I would say salads, maybe not as always popularly defined. I would say specialty meats. So I'm thinking about nkwobi, a cow foot stew, isiewu, a goat head stew. I would say fritters. I would say snacks. I would say fresh juices, drinks, herbal tonics. I would say lots of cereal, drinks, and porridges. And I feel like there are so many elements of West African cuisine that are popular across the world. So almost all cultures and cuisines have, whether it's called a curry, a sauce, some other name, right? Most cultures have a healing broth, like pepper soup. Right? Every culture has that kind of chicken soup thing that refreshes you, that is, people enjoy for dinner, people use when they're just out of hospital or recovering. So there's that healing broth. Street food as snacks. Like there's almost all cultures have some kind of fried dough, whether that's yeasted or non-yeasted. So puff puff, beaufort, that family of fried foods. And then you have the starches. So in West Africa, we're talking plantains, yams, taro, cocoyam. We're talking cassava, beans. We're talking about millet, sorghum, or guinea corn, as we call it, and a host of others. And then you have the soups. And the soups, you have like soups that are thickened with greens or thickened with nuts, seeds, gums. You have sauces that are made with like vegetables, and whether those are like garden egg or eggplant, tomatoes, onions, pepper, right? So you kind of have those buckets.
Would you say that palm oil, right, in our cooking, would you say that something that we do kind of more using palm oil? I know I've seen it in some Brazilian cooking, but we know that that comes from, that was taken over there by the enslaved people who kept that heritage. So I don't know, do East Africans cook with palm oil the way we do and other parts of Africa?
I don't think I've come. I feel like maybe Central Africa, but I don't know. I'm more familiar with West African cuisine, where we use our palm oil, red palm oil. We use shea butter. We use groundnut oil. Yeah.
So in your TED Talk, you also, today you mentioned it, right? You said your dad was a really good cook. Was there a particular dish he made that you enjoyed, or was there something he made particularly well that kind of sticks with you today?
So my dad wasn't a huge fan of tomatoes, curry powder, dried thyme, or vegetable oil, any kind of neutral oil. So he used mostly palm oil, lots of onions and peppers in his cooking. And he made the best grilled chicken I've ever had. And all he would do was get chicken, broilers as we call them, so slightly more tender chickens, marinate them overnight in blended onions, pepper, and salt. Like those three things. And then the next day, this was typically around Christmas or any holidays. Next day he would grill that chicken. Oh my. There's nothing. I have never tasted chicken so good. And it's like, there are no stock cubes. Not a single one. My father did not believe in stock cubes. So we didn't use stock cubes in cooking for him. But just those three ingredients, and it was out of the world. It was out of this world. And I think that he understood how to cook flavor, right? He understood how to cook something for long enough. He understood the balance of ingredients. Yeah. Outstanding. So yeah, his chicken, A+.
Do you recreate it today in your kitchen?
I haven't, because somehow I don't feel like I can, but also I don't have a grill, like a charcoal grill. And maybe when I do, I will try.
Nice. So in your journey of, researching the history of West African cuisine, are there certain things that surprised you? Any historical facts that you found, particularly surprising along the way?
Many, but the recent one that fascinates me is eggs in Nigerian cuisine. So Nigerian cuisine is we have many uses of eggs, and I'm a big explorer of cookbooks as historical lenses, right? So I kind of research cookbooks, research recipes, because they give insight into events, practices, techniques of that particular time, right? One of the earliest cookbooks I found on Nigerian cuisine is from around 1910. It was written by two British women who were living in the north of Nigeria. And in that book, there are mentions of the poor quality of Nigerian eggs and how, because Nigerians apparently didn't really eat eggs at the time. There are many myths and beliefs about eggs that some of them still persist today. Like if you eat too many eggs, you become a thief, you become greedy.
Yeah.
So in that 1910 cookbook, they talked about how the eggs were only good for during elections, for throwing at. Because there's a history of egg throwing from the 19th century, if not before that, in England, and across the world, probably even earlier. But there's a history of egg throwing, and so they kind of reference that in this 1910 cookbook. Fast forward to 1934, there's another cookbook, and this time eggs feature so heavily in this cookbook. It's a cookbook / textbook, and it's called the Kudeti Book of Yoruba Cookery. And in this book, there's just lots and lots of things about eggs. Akara eggs. Basically, they look like Scotch eggs, but the coating is akara, fried in palm oil. There are all sorts of balls, yam balls, rice balls with eggs. There's eggs in efo. Many of these sound weird to have eggs. And then I find this thesis written by a lady in 2017. And it talked about how eggs there was a deliberate attempt of the British colonialists to include eggs in Nigerian diets. So this was 19th Great Depression. Most proteins were scarce or cost a lot. At that time, the Nigerian economy was tough, but there were also global concerns about malnutrition. And there were concerns that Nigerians were malnourished. The reason Nigerians were malnourished was because British colonialists had changed the agricultural landscape. They had gone from farming multiple crops, polycultures, to monoculture, farming things. They had changed things from food crops to cash crops for export. And so farmers who before were doing subsistence farming, providing for their families, were no longer able to do that. And this was because the British, that whole colonial engine was exporting this cash crops and making money for the colonial government. So that impacted agriculture. But in addition, there were also really high taxes on food, right? So people couldn't even afford things that they were able to afford before. Rather than the colonial government focusing on addressing the root causes of malnutrition, they decided that it was going to be through education. They were going to educate people on how to eat better with limited resources. And the channel they chose was to use women under the banner of domesticity and domestic science. They were going to train women so they could feed their families better. And eggs emerged as a cheap option to include in all sorts of meals under this banner of domestic science. So it's documented, right? They're documented words that say, we'll introduce eggs as a way to, support this malnutrition rather than addressing the root causes. So I think that for me is stunning in its clarity, because you're eggs are such everyday foods that to think that their present abundance in Nigerian recipes was something that happened organically, and then to discover that it didn't, it shocks me, because eggs aren't it's just such a casual thing, right? But to see that there was, there's a whole chain of events behind that, I think was quite stunning to me.
Wow. I am mind blown by that background. I guess maybe would you say that is also the influence on Ghanaians and their love of eggs? Because
I know that some of it extended to Ghana, but I can't speak to the history, because Ghanaians say that there are many practices that probably historic practices that include eggs. So I haven't researched that. I haven't researched Ghanaian cuisine. Thought did occur to me, because in this paper, there are also some mentions of Ghana. But this whole egg thing was also present in East Africa and other parts of the continent, And so through cookbooks, I've been able to trace kind of at least different perspectives and approaches to eggs. I've been able to look at the cookbooks and say, okay, there are eggs here, but the egg recipes here are more X, Y, Z. Whether they're more French inspired or. Cookbooks have really helped me unravel some of the mysteries, along with all of these research papers that I've come across.
That is very interesting. I want to ask if you found anything, because I don't remember where I learned this. It was a documentary or something I was watching where they said in Senegal, for instance, they use the grains that were native, millet, fonio. And then the French imported rice and wanted the Senegalese to buy rice because that made them money. And so they shunned the other local produce and pushed rice. And that is how we came to a point where we have rice and Bourdain being the Senegalese dish, but it's not something that was local initially.
So I've heard and read about that, about scarcities that led to shortages of the local indigenous grains, and basically the French introducing this rice, particularly from Vietnam, and just kind of replacing that. And I think logically it makes sense, right? Because we see some of those replacements. We talk about cassava on the continent. Cassava was on the continent for centuries, but never really took root because, the special processing to render it friendly to eat, right? And at the end of enslavement in like the late 1800s, with the enslaved people returning, they brought knowledge of processing and all of that. And what was also interesting was that the colonialists pushed for cassava to be grown because cassava is really hardy, right? Doesn't need a lot of water, co-crop with many other crops, right? So this expansion of cassava across the continent was also part of colonial imposition, I will say.
That is fascinating because I want to say in Cameroon, no other food crop does as much heavy lifting as cassava. We have cassava as gari. We have cassava. We have mionda and we have bobolo, which are cousins. One is just big. One is sold cooked and it's bigger. Bobolo is cooked and it's bigger. Miondo is raw and skinnier, but the same thing. And then in the central region, you have mitumba, which is kind of like miondo because it's also slightly fermented. But then in its case, you put a little bit of salt and palm oil, and then it's steamed also, and it can be eaten as a snack or eaten with stews as the starch for eating a meal. And then we also have it fermented as watafufu. And Anga, did I finish all of the cassava? And then boiled cassava also, and roasted cassava.
Like chips and...
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
That's fascinating. So one thing we talk about often on this podcast is how culture is dynamic, right? And in certain areas of our culture, I think as Africans, we're kind of resistant to this idea that, things are changing or we have been influenced by the outside world, essentially. So I don't know have you seen with cuisine, have you seen any trends where West African cuisine is being influenced by other global trends, or how is it changing, if there is a noticeable change over the years since you've been studying?
I think it changed way before I even was born. Like, think about the ubiquitousness of rice, just how common rice is, how common vegetable oils are. I think the biggest thing is that we're seeing more processed and ultra-processed foods, right? You're seeing many fast food places in Nigeria. All of the big chains, not just in Nigeria, across West Africa, like all of the big chains have, whether it's Burger King or Domino's Pizza. So we're seeing that global northwesternized way of eating, convenience, seeping into our cuisine and culture. Yeah, I think it's just mostly a lot of those convenience foods.
What about in terms of our traditional quote unquote recipes, right? Do you see those recipes kind of being reimagined, or are we more, would you say West Africans our recipes are a little bit more stagnated, because that has a negative connotation, but not being reimagined and, kind of, are we as playful, I would say, as other, people of other regions when it comes to our cuisine?
I think for a fact we are. I see lots of creativity in that space. Like, I see people, that was one of the pillars behind my new Nigerian kitchen philosophy. Is an ingredient is an ingredient, right? But how can we transform it? How can we explore it to understand the full dimension of the possibility, because like even pounded yam, like even our staples have multiple lives, right? There's so much that you can do with gari. It's gluten-free, has similar textures to cornmeal. So you could use it as you can use it to bread, deep fried things, right? So for me, it's like understanding the structural framework. What's the function of this thing? What's the texture? How can we apply it? I see a lot of that sort of creativity, lots and lots of it. But when we think about food, I think there's always a small portion of people anywhere in the world, any culture or cuisine, who are enthusiasts, who are the ones who are engaging with food on a media level, on a level where they're communicating with it in different ways. And we may not see some of those things trickle down to the majority of people who eat. But there's always a group of people who are exploring cuisine and culture and food culture in new and interesting ways.
I've told Bilala before that, and I've seen it, people do with Nigerian cuisine, right? Like I see caterers here in Houston and online who kind of, reimagine like Nigerian cuisine, especially for finger foods. Like somebody will make, I don't know how to pronounce it, but that whatever you guys eat agege bread with, that bean thing.
Agree.
Yes, I've seen somebody like make it into a little like appetizer like version. So like very cute little things like that. And I wish we had something similar in Cameroonian cuisine. There are probably people out there doing it, but I wish we had like more of those.
Beignet haricot.
Performer beans, yeah.
It's very similar, right? It's a very similar concept.
Yes, but I think, and I guys talking from a point of like, I don't want to say elevated, but just
I hate that word. I hate that word. I hate that word with a passion. Elevating for who?
True.
But I get a sense of what you mean. But I think that like we're in an early phase of this reimagining and rediscovery of ourselves and of our cuisines and having a sense of pride. I get the concept of elevation, but I hate it because like we accept mediocrity in so many other places. Why should I be the one who why is it left to me as the Black person to have to present something? I've eaten so many mediocre things and cuisines that were highly rated. Please, let's all be like, whatever I present, take it like that. And that doesn't close off a desire to explore and experiment and to, kind of represent and create and make things look beautiful. But they have value regardless, right? And that's the point that I'd like to share, that there's value regardless.
I think one of like maybe 10 years ago when I got on like the food blog space and I first ran into Chef Rex, and at the time Lohi's Creations had her blog, and it wasn't so, I'm not going to use elevation, but it was like a food that I was familiar with that was reimagined. I always remember this it was gari and okra, seafood okra soup that Chef Rex did for Bella Niger, but it looked so beautiful and so appealing that I wanted to eat the screen. And that is how I like to think of it. Like, at least when I think about introducing food, it's not so much even changing it, but just serving it in a way that when somebody looks at it, it's like, I want to try that. And I think we see a lot of Nigerian chefs do that. Like we see Chef Michael Elegbede, like his kitchen in Lagos, where I'm just always looking at it and salivating, but looking through the screen, like it just looks visually appealing. Because I know in Cameroon, we have a lot of food, but we serve it and we know what it is, so we go for it. But somebody, to the unfamiliar and untrained eye, it might not be served in a way where the person wants to dive in as.
See, that's, what, I used to say this thing, right? But I'm kind of rethinking whether it's because, to your point, Ozoz, are we just familiar with seeing certain Western cuisines? Because my favorite Cameroonian meal is ekwang. And I used to be like, if somebody asked me, somebody who was not Cameroonian or even West African, and I showed them a picture, like it wouldn't look appetizing to them. And I used to be like, but you just have to know, like, But I feel like we're doing a disservice to ourselves when we say that it's not visually appealing. It's visually appealing to me.
So I think one thing I've learned and really seeing is that different cultures and cuisines have their own palette, so in terms of color, and palette in terms of taste preferences. Because how can I explain to someone that I like soft and soft, like I like eba and okra soup, right? Because when you're thinking about some other cuisines, it's always about texture and balance and crunch versus. But I like soft and soft. Like I can eat yam pottage. I think we have to recognize that there are differences. I do understand the bit about making an effort, right? Like obviously I have my home clothes and then I have my going to work clothes. And as much as I'd like to go to work in my home clothes, that does not always work, right? And I see some of that with food as well. Like, making an effort to celebrate, to provide the best version of a thing. So I just want to be clear in my mind, for me, I want to be clear that my intent is not pandering. And I have, believe me, I have pandered. Believe me, I have, I'm coming into myself. I'm coming into my understanding of my identity, of my cuisine, about the things that I value. And honestly, now I care less about what anyone thinks. Maybe 10 years ago, I didn't. Maybe 10 years ago, I wasn't as carefree, right? But now I'm like, you don't like it? Really? Yours to figure out, I'm not here to explain or to cajole, but I want people to fall in love with Nigerian cuisine. I want people to understand that comparison can be great, but when it gets to a point of ascribing value, then it's a thief of joy, right? And when it gets to a stage where we're putting one over the other, no. But yes, we can talk about and explore similarities and, and we can't like everything. I like most Nigerian things, but there's some things, even though I can't tell you what now, but there's some things that I may not like, but so everyone can, there's room for everyone to have their own preferences.
I think to Bill's last point though, or in addition to it, I think, right, in the diaspora, right, in the US, I complain a lot about Cameroonian restaurants and Nigerian restaurants, at least in Houston, they're a little bit better. But I think they are a little bit better in terms of, customer service, in terms of the presentation of the restaurant. That's part of the experience for somebody who's coming to try your cuisine, right? To your point, like I went to a ramen place the other day and just before I even ate the food, like just the decor, everything, like it was, you know what I mean? Like the vibe was giving what it needed to give. But I feel like, you walk into a Cameroonian restaurant, the way they greet you first of all, so I think we could make more effort in that regard. If, the food, fine, but like also our presentation in, at least in the restaurants here, I think we could do a better job of, being more inviting, even just us, because we're the ones who patronize those places more than like the Americans. So Bill, I'm with you to an extent on that. I think we could be more inviting.
Well, I say that I had a really bad customer service experience in Houston last weekend, which is why I'm like, absolutely not. And it was a Nigerian place. And when we looked at their reviews on Sunday, so we went on Saturday, there were 4 new 1-star reviews within the 24 hours after we left. So, but I always joke, and I don't know, I think it's our fault because this particular establishment, the food is amazing. The customer service is on the other end of the spectrum. And I think because we are all homesick, we want a taste of home and something familiar. People trek over there and they just bear with it. Like, okay, maybe I only come here once a month, but everybody's doing the same thing. So there's no incentive to change. And as we say, if the customer service sucks, the food is probably great. And that applies to African and Caribbean restaurants.
But I think, there's a there's something that happens to you that you begin to take pride in all that you do, right? And you begin to, like, I don't ever want anyone to abuse Nigerians or Nigerian cuisine. I can do that. That's my prerogative. That's open to you. If you are not Nigerian, thank you very much. But I want to be proud of the work that I do, not for pride's sake, but for the sake of living a legacy, right? For the sake of setting an example for my children primarily, first of all, and then my nieces and nephews, and it continues. Because I feel like that's essential to my identity as a Nigerian. I know that I grew up with excellent Nigerians who set standards for so many other things. And I feel like generally I see a decline in this sense of standards. I don't want to say excellence, because again, I should be able to just be average, but I should have a framework of being thorough, being respectful, being, there are certain things that I should be able to stand by. I should be able to, what's the word? I should be able to demonstrate, regardless of who, what, where, when. I feel like sometimes social media shows us, I'm not saying social media causes it, but Nigerians call it anyhowness. And I think that sometimes we just see this I don't care attitude, like it doesn't really matter, and they'll still come, sure they're hungry. But we can be better. We can definitely be better. We can do better.
Agreed. So one thing that fascinated me, and you've talked about this before, right? I was watching a documentary on Netflix, and they were going to different countries, and they went to Brazil in, I believe it's called Bahia, where it's like the heavy Black population. And they were talking about acarajé, and I screamed because I was like, that's Accra. And the fact that they're making it and the name has remained almost, I found that so fascinating. And you talked about it as well in your TED Talk. Are there other foods that you've come across like that have kind of survived across the Atlantic? Because I found that to be so fascinating.
So it's not just Brazil that has a version of acarajé, right? Across the Caribbean, you'll find acarajé. You'll find it same fritters, some with different ingredients. There's some you'll find with like taro, some with beans, different types of beans. So there are like 14 or 15 countries where I've identified a dish similar to akara, all the way to the American South, where they have a rice fritter called callas. And you can see through the name that they're all versions and variations of this akara theme. There is fufu, which exists across the Caribbean, across many parts of South America. So essentially, either cassava-based or plantain or cornmeal, similar kind of pounded, mashed, doughy sides. You have dishes that are wrapped, right? So whether that's like moi moi, but you have like blue draws in Jamaica, and you have that kind of tamale wrapped dish across many parts. There's a dish that's popular at Easter in Nigeria. We call it mingao de tapioca, and feijão as well. And you'll find examples of those in Brazil mostly, but also in other parts. So there are many dishes that I like to think of as connecting us across multiple countries, experiences, and places.
And I mean, our listeners, I was checking out Feast Afrique, which is, this curated resource that you have. And I was really fascinated. There are old recipes there from the Caribbean, from the American South. And it's such a great resource to explore. And yeah, I found that really fascinating as well. So can you talk a little bit about how food helps us kind of maintain and express our cultural identity, especially as people in the diaspora?
Food, like other aspects of culture, music, language, dance, architecture, dress, I think it builds a sense of similarity and sameness, right? So if I see someone wearing a Nigerian style outfit, there's almost an unspoken kinship with them, whether they're from my part of the country or not. And it's the same thing as when I see them consume or explore food. Like my physical characteristics were built on Nigerian food, right? Like they were built on a combination of eba, soaked gari, rice and stew, dodo, beans, agege bread. Like my physical manifestation is a result of that cuisine. And like the things that I crave when I am hungry, the things that I serve guests when they visit, the things I talk about as a professor of food and tourism studies, when I'm sharing examples or trying to explore foodways or find connections between cultures, it all comes back to my identity as a Nigerian, to the things that I've tasted, right? My palate, my ability to compare cuisines all comes back to the fact that I'm Nigerian, the fact that I've explored and experienced Nigerian cuisine in a particular way. So when I think about food, I think about the ingredients I automatically reach for when I go grocery shopping. The fact that, I can understand flavors in other cuisines because of my Nigerian palate. So when I've run out of crayfish, I can go buy Vietnamese or Thai dried shrimp to use instead. When I want palm nut concentrate, I can go look for French-speaking African stores to buy sauce bread. There's so many. My culture, my identity helps me explore and connect with other cultures.
So I didn't know this, but Bilala told me that you were on Anthony Bourdain's episode of Parts Unknown. It aired in 2017, I believe, when he visited Lagos. I think that's so cool because I'm a huge fan. Rest in peace. But just because I couldn't let you go without asking, what was that experience like? And do you think that episode did justice in representing or featuring the food in Lagos?
It was definitely one of those times in my life that I had always dreamt of, but just couldn't even figure out a path to meeting Anthony Bourdain, rest his soul. And I think I was blessed because I got to cook for him, and then so I met him twice. I got to cook for him. A company hosted him for lunch and, invited me to make the lunch. And that was beautiful because, first of all, I didn't realize that he was so tall. I know it feels like such a banal thing to mention, but also you sense that he was genuinely interested in what was going on. Right? There were no airs. There was a lot of curiosity and a lot of respect. And that's how I've always approached food, this sense of this is the thing that nourishes us both physically and spiritually and emotionally. It's what sustains us. And so that was great. And then, but in that case, the first time I met him, I didn't really get a chance. We spoke a bit, but the second time we met, when we sat together at lunch, was really, really interesting because it was a different perspective. And yeah, it's just is a dream come true. And honestly, the world lost a gift.
Agreed.
I have to ask, what did you serve at the company lunch that you cooked for?
So I think there was snails, there was pomo, there was rice. I made an agbalumo drink, and I think I made zobo. There were kind of a few different things.
Wow, snails! You got me at snails.
I asked because my sister's first reaction when the news broke was just like, damn, he died without ever tasting Eru, which is Afa. Because she was just like, if she ever had the opportunity to meet him, that is the one thing she would have wanted him to taste. And so her first thing was just like, damn, he died and he never got to taste Eru. So hopefully he tasted Afang when he was in Lagos.
I know for sure there was a Gusi and maybe a four. I'm not sure, but
Sure.
but he spent some time, spent a few weeks in Lagos, and
Nice. That's awesome. All right, final question. What is a beginner-friendly recipe, your blog or elsewhere, that you would recommend for a beginner of West African cuisine?
African cuisine. Can this person cook?
I mean, sure, they can follow a recipe.
Okay, they could make a drink. There's a recipe for Chapman on my blog. Chapman is a Nigerian drink that combines bitters with blackcurrant or grenadine cordial, sodas. So orange soda, lime and lemon soda, but also vegetables. So cucumbers typically, and
Oh,
also fresh lemon or fresh lime. So I definitely say that's one thing I could recommend. But there are also lots of others. They could explore suya, garden egg sauce, pepper soup. That's one of the best performing posts on my blog.
okay.
And has been for like the last 10 years without fail.
Wow. Okay.
So in these days, there's access to prepared blends of pepper soup spice. So that's definitely one people can explore, whether they have dietary preferences. So if you're not a meat eater, you could do seafood. You could also explore vegetables,
Yeah, pepper soup is a good one. Yeah, for sure.
I would say I've contributed to a lot of clicks for the pepper soup recipe because and I'll explain it because when I start, so like for a very brief moment in time I attempted to be a food blogger, but consistency was not my friend. And I was always fascinated looking at Nigerian recipes for pepper soup because everybody just talked about pepper soup mix. And I would always say, what is pepper soup mix? Because in Cameroon, we don't have that. And I wanted to compare the ingredients. And your blog has been the only place that had the ingredients broken down. So I always go back to that whenever I'm trying to make a point of having a conversation to say, this is the breakdown. And this, because it gave me a perspective of what was in it. Because we don't have that. I know in Cameroon, it's like you boil the meat and like one of the anchors of Cameroonian pepper soup is janksa.
Janksa.
Yes. And I kept trying to ask people, but nobody seemed to be able to answer. Like everybody's go-to was, I just buy pepper soup mix.
I'm so glad that brings me a lot of joy. First of all, thank you for sharing that. Because sometimes when I first started writing my blog, I was writing more for an external gaze than I was for myself. I don't know how to. I think maybe I was writing more for people to notice than I was for me. I don't know. But so it's, I'm not even sure where I was going with that thought. But along the way, I started writing for me. I write a lot for me. I write for me to answer questions that I have, because I feel like other people might have those same questions, as opposed to focusing on an external gaze, because I found that I was getting overwhelmed with trying to figure out what I wanted. The momentum. I remember once, early in my blogging career, I went for a sushi workshop, and I was like, people are really going to love this sushi post. I documented every aspect of that workshop. I think I got a handful of comments, and I was devastated because I was like, I put so much work into it, made videos, all of that. Some time later, I did a post I made like mini butterscotch tarts or something. And in those days, I was traveling when I wrote that particular post. So I didn't have time to do what I would normally do, my normal blog hopping, which is like go to blogs, leave comments, so they would visit my blog. I didn't have time to do that. That post, the comments that post got, I'm saying minimal effort, that blog post got way more comments than my sushi post ever got. And I was like, I think that was a good brain reset, because it was like you have to stop performing. This performative approach needs to end. And I think that was very, very important for me, because I could be internally motivated. I didn't need people's applause or kind words to create work or to do work. I would create regardless. And it's something that I still hold true today, even though sometimes I look at my Instagram, like I have 50K plus Instagram followers. Sometimes I do posts, I write posts and they're like 20 likes. I'm like it's not an accurate reflection. But the beautiful thing that is, in the past where it would have been like, there would have been despair. I'm just like, look, I have shared what I want to share. I have gotten my own inner release. I have cataloged, I have documented, and I'm good with that, right? And when I think of it sometimes, like if 20 people came up to me in a group of 1,000, I would still be overwhelmed. I feel like sometimes social media numbers make us lose sight of what that looks in physical terms. Like 20 people coming up to you in the midst of 2,000 people would be overwhelming. Like if you met 20 brand new people, it would be like, oh, I may feel conscious. And so I'm just going to have to accept, I've since come to accept that those numbers don't determine much. They don't determine my value or my worth, right? And, and I know that there's some people, there are things I've posted and one person has responded and said, this is life transforming. That's good enough, right? So.
That's true, especially in these days of the algorithm, and like these apps are like, you don't even know how the algorithm works. It'll break you if you're looking at, how your posts are performing. Like you said, at some point you have to just decide that you're doing it for yourself, and
I'll still look. But that, so for instance, I've been finding, like, I started my YouTube channel 14 years ago, but then abandoned it at several points, and now I'm trying to get back to YouTube because I genuinely enjoy creating long form content, and I want to get back. Like, there's so many things that I guess I don't. It's easier to talk about them than write. And so, I'm trying to get back. And so sometimes I look at my YouTube numbers and like, oh, okay. But I'm not, I feel like when I'm ready to ask people to subscribe and follow and, and when I'm sharing content with them, that it'll be growth will be a natural outcome of this exchange, whether that is production and consumption. Yeah.
Well, speaking of, the Instagram is at Kitchen Butterfly. The website is kitchenbutterfly.com. And the resource site that I was talking about is feastafrique.com. I highly recommend that. I found that so fascinating. But Ozoz, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation. It was really great to have you here. I'm going to go look for that pepper soup recipe. Or if Billa has it bookmarked, so she can send it to me.
I probably do.
For our listeners, if you're reading along with us, our August book of the month is Butter, Honey, Pig Bread by Francesca Equiasi. Have you read it?
I read it. Loved it.
Okay.
Enjoyed it.
I'm reading it now. Yeah, I'm reading it now, and it's really good.
I enjoy stories of everyday life and people that include food as an element.
And you can follow us on YouTube at 2Bs in a Pod. We are on Instagram at 2Bs Pod. And we always end our episodes with a proverb. So until next time.
Road for go Lagos is easy, but for come back now, wire.
True words. But whether it's because you finished your money in Lagos or because there's something holding you down there, Yeah.
So for our listeners who don't speak Pidgin, the translation is the road to go to Lagos is easy. To come back is the problem. I guess what do you call it? What's the interpretation or the life message from that proverb? It's like going to enjoy is easy, but like
I don't know that it's easy to leave Lagos. Lagos is beautiful and chaotic and abundant and like stressful. Like it's just so many things. It's a fascinating place. The ecology, economy, the makeup of Lagos is mind blowing. So you might go there and just get stuck. Like you're like get stuck in wonder. So yeah. There are many reasons why you may not be able to return from Lagos as easily as you went.